When you look online for a method to make soft and fluffy bread, you'll probably come across the tangjong or yudane methods. These two are practically mainstay methods for making tender and moist bread. But look into them and their differences, and you'll find something a little bit interesting. So these are the Chinese characters for tangjong, and these are the Japanese kanji for yudane. As you can see, they're exactly the same. It's quite interesting that in English they're considered to be different, when if you were to search for recipes in Chinese, they would refer to both yudane and tangjong as just tangjong. It's pretty much the same way in Japanese, except that they call it yudane. Now, you may be wondering, since both languages share the same characters, where is it originally from then? And the answer to that is Japan. Yudane is the earlier one. It's said to have come out of a cultural exchange between European and Japanese bakers, especially ones from the Hokkaido region. Which makes a lot of sense because there is a very similar, practically the same technique in Europe that's very old. It's called scalding flour. And it's basically the same thing as the Japanese version of yudane, pouring boiling water over flour. What's interesting to note, though, is that despite the technique being Japanese in origin, the term yudane is not as popular as the Chinese tangjong in English. This is supposed to be due to a book published by the author Yvonne Chen called 65 degrees Celsius Tangchong Bread. This book is where tangchong is said to have started popping up, and it also popularized the technique to many places. In the book, the author does make note of the Japanese origin, although her way of making it was pretty different than the original Japanese version, which has now led to the two main groups of methods in making yudane or tangjong. When English recipes talk about the yudane method, they are most frequently talking about the more original Japanese version, where you pour boiling water over the flour. On the other hand, when they say the tangjong method, they probably mean the more recent version that was popularized by the book I just mentioned. In this version, you do things a little differently. You add water and then flour into a pan, mix together, and then you heat it up together. So which one is better? Well, actually, before we can dive into that, we need to look at the underlying principle behind how both of these methods work. The underlying principle behind both methods is the same, and it's called starch gelatinization. This is the main factor behind the benefits that tangjong or yudane bring to bread. So what is starch gelatinization? Well, a commonly used example is pasta. When you boil dried pasta and make it soft and tasty, that's starch gelatinization at work. In our specific situation, since we've only got water and flour, we're looking at the starch granules in the flour. Heating up the water and flour mixture causes the starch granules to basically loosen up, allowing water to come in. As we heat it up more and more, the starch granules absorb more and more water, until at a specific temperature, they can't take it any longer, they can't absorb any more, and so they burst, releasing starch molecules into their surroundings. At this point, the whole mixture should have reached a gel-like consistency, partly as a result due to the burst starch granules. This whole process is starch gelatinization. It also happens when we bake bread in the oven. What's special about tangjong or yudane is that we do this in advance. We take a part of the total flour and water and heat it up in advance. This, when mixed into the dough, spreads the gelatinized starch throughout. They create a layer that holds in the moisture and can absorb more water. This is what leads to the bread being softer and keeping fresh for longer. So this is where it all stems from. Both the original Japanese yudane method, where you pour boiling water over the flour, and the more recent tangjong method, where you heat water and flour together in a pan, they both achieved starch gelatinization. But due to their own specifics, their ways of making may be more or less convenient for you. So it leads to our important question. Which one is better, and what is the best way to make this? Well, the thing is, their differences are actually very minimal. We've tried both methods several times, and we found they produced very similar results, where there were barely any differences. If there were any, they were very small, basically unnoticeable. But that's only if they were made correctly. For example, when we made the original yudane version, we found that the water that you poured can cool down quite quickly. Starch gelatinization requires temperatures of at least 60 degrees Celsius. If the water temperature drops below that, starch gelatinization will not be achieved. So, after some trial and error and research, we found a set of optimal steps for making both tangjong or yudane, both methods. So, we start with the version that's made on the stove, the tangjong method. And first, we prepare the flour and water. How much of each you use is dependent on the recipe you're following and how much bread you want to make, so that's up to you. However, the flour to water ratio is generally unchanging. A 1:5 flour to water ratio is the most common and also very convenient to prepare. So that's what we're using here. We'll measure out the flour and the water in advance. Then we're going to pour the water into a pan first and then add in the flour. It's really a small thing, but it helps reduce the formation of lumps of flour at the bottom. After that, we mix until it's homogeneous first, because the heating process is very quick. If there are any lumps of flour in the tangjong, we won't be able to break them up during that time. So we need to make sure there aren't any right now. Once it looks well mixed and lump-free, we set it atop the stove. It's best to turn it to a low fire so that the mixture is evenly cooked throughout and doesn't burn. As soon as we start the heat, we need to make sure to continuously stir the tangjong. The temperature that the entire tangjong needs to reach is somewhere around 60 to 65 degrees Celsius. We can't stop heating it before that, and we also can't go too far over it. Otherwise, we run the risk of getting rid of too much water and damaging other parts of the flour. As we continue heating it up, the tangjong should thicken further the warmer it gets. Once it gets to the 60 to 65 degrees Celsius range, we turn off the heat, and while continuously stirring it, we move the tangjong to a bowl to cool down. Grab a bit of plastic wrap, cover it, making sure the wrap touches all the open surface of the mixture so it doesn't form a skin on top and so no condensation drops back onto the mixture. You can use it immediately after it's cooled to room temperature, or you can also store it in the fridge for later use. You can leave it in the fridge for up to a week or longer, as long as it doesn't turn gray or goes awry somehow. There are some recipes that actually recommend this step, especially Asian ones. They recommend leaving the tangjong in the fridge overnight at minimum, or even longer. Some sources say that it makes the resulting bread taste better or have a more supple texture. We've tried leaving the tangjong in there for over a week, and nothing happened to it. The texture stayed the same, and the results were also unchanging. So if there was any difference between leaving it to age or using it immediately, they seemed quite minimal. That's how we would make it with the more recent tangjong version. However, for various reasons, you might prefer to use the more original Japanese yudane version. So, again, while the specific amount of flour and water you use is dependent on your recipe, the flour to water ratio is generally unchanging. For this method, it uses a 1:1 flour to water ratio, unlike the previous 1:5. The method is simple enough, just pour boiling water over the flour and then mix it well. There are two caveats to this though, and the first is that the water has to be at boiling point. It cannot be any lower in temperature, or we risk the starch not being fully gelatinized. This can lead to a sticky yudane, so very hot boiling water is necessary to make this method work. However, even with the water temperature right, we've found the water can cool down very quickly after it's been poured. It may drop below the temperature required for the starch gelatinization, so we looked into it and recommend heating the bowl first by boiling some extra water, then pouring that water into the bowl so that the bowl gets nice and hot, and then we can add in the boiling water and the flour. Again, water first, then flour, because it prevents lumps. Mixing it all together immediately. It shouldn't take too long. Be careful with this part though, because the udane is quite hot. Once it looks homogeneous enough, we can either use it immediately or wrap it in plastic wrap to store in the fridge. Just like with our previous method, storing it in the fridge overnight or for longer is a step sometimes recommended by some recipes. Unlike the previous on-stove method though, this step may actually show some difference for this method. When we compared the udane made 3 days ago to the freshly made one, we found that the udane actually developed a small but noticeable amount of gluten. Although we haven't seen much effect on the bread, it may be a little bit beneficial. It doesn't seem like a very large benefit though, so it's really still up to you whether you want to use the udane immediately or want to make it in advance. With that then, we've gone through the 2 versions of what we found to be the best ways to make the tangzhong or udane. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching.